Our first reading this morning is from the book Take What You Need by Reverend Jen Crow. The day after our house fire, I showed up at the church office to hand off my responsibilities. Given the fact that I didn't yet have a pair of clean underwear, let alone a dress shirt, it didn't seem like I'd be able to do much for a little while. Once we handled all the practicalities like preaching dates and payroll, I made my way to the classroom where my kids were playing with the Director of Children, Youth, and Family Ministries. She came over to me. "I've done some research," she said, "and one of the recommendations for kids who suffered a loss like this is to ask them for a list of comfort items, things that make them feel at home wherever they are, and start replacing them as soon as possible. Can you help them make a list and let me know what's on it? And oh yeah," she said, "can you make one for yourselves too?" Well, grateful for her thoughtfulness, I agreed. Well, it was easy to make the list with the kids, easy to let people help them. I discovered it was much harder when it came to myself. We joked that day that my new spiritual practice was going to be saying yes when people offered to help. "You can be choosy about who you let in," she said, "and turn away things that aren't actually helpful. But," she added, "you might want to consider saying yes a whole lot more than you're inclined to." And the second reading is A Theology Adequate for the Night by Nancy Schaefer. Not God as unmoved mover, one who set the earth in motion and withdrew. Not the one to thank when those cherished do not die. For providence includes equally power to harm. Not a God of exactings, as if love could be earned or subtracted. But this may work in the night. Something that breathes with us as others sleep. Something that breathes also those sleeping, so no one is alone. Something that is the beginning of love, and also each part of how love is completed. Something so large, wherever we are not separate, which teaches again the way to start over. Night is the test. When grief lies uncovered and longing shows clear. When nothing we do can hasten earth's turning or delay it. This may be adequate for the night, this holding. Something that steadfastly breathes us, which we also are learning to breathe.
May I be filled with loving kindness. May I be well. May I be filled with loving kindness. May I be well. May I be peaceful and at ease. May I
if you think about it much at all, the idea of independence, it's silly. I mean, sure, it is an idea that we glorify in this culture, in this country. We've built a whole culture around the notion that anyone in this country can do anything they want by their own hard work if they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We lionize the image of the self-made man, and it's usually a man in that image. The icon of the lone and stoic hero, the sanctity of the individual right of conscience, personal salvation. In a couple of nights, we'll have bright bombs literally bursting in air as the crowds ooh and ah over how independent this country is and how it makes us special, exceptional. And it is all silliness, nonsense. I mean, have you ever seen someone try to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps? The best they can hope for is to be crouched there, clutching at their ankles. More than likely, they're just going to tip over. Either way, they look silly. Let's take those fireworks on Tuesday, for example. They celebrate a myth, a partial story. The white men who took over the United States didn't break away from England independently. At a bare minimum, we need to acknowledge the help they got from the French and from the Oneida and Stockbridge Mohican nations. The independent nation that they established had an economy that was more or less self-sufficient because they built it on the backs of people enslaved from Africa. Women, still pretty much regarded as property of their fathers or their husbands at that time, made so much of what the white men were doing possible that they could just take it for granted. But, Chad, you're saying to yourselves, we know all that. We're good liberals. We're Unitarian Universalists. And that's fair, to a point. I know my audience. I doubt anyone here really needs me to remind them of those big gaps in our national story. Maybe you don't need me to point out the ways that the independence of people who look mostly like me depended on slave labor and exploitation of men and women from places like China, who we were happy to take labor from, but refused to make citizens. Or how the independence of our towns and cities and states depended on our willingness to just take the lands of the Anishinaabe and the Dakota and the Cherokee and the Navajo, and you get my point. Or the ways our independent economy depended and still depends on people working long hours for low wages and on acting like masters of a planet rather than its stewards. We know all that and more. We know that independence depends. Still, this morning I want to make a couple of points. And the first is that we need to keep being reminded of all the people, all of the things that we depend on, and the ways that we depend on them. And second, I want to remind us how great that interdependence could be, should be. So first, the reminders. I wrote all this yesterday, and then I listened to the news this morning. And I'm going to follow the script, I promise. But all of this against the backdrop of the reminders this week of how blind we are to what it has taken to get to this place in this country, who we have depended on, and how we have not recognized, compensated, respected them for what we have built out of that, what I get out of that. And I know we can talk about that as a culture, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically about how we as Unitarian Universalists have been part of that story, and still are. So a bit of UU history, because our faith does have some deep roots in the American independence myth. Let us look, for example, at slavery. Many Unitarians and Universalists sought its abolition, but not all. And even some who opposed slavery didn't want to make it a big issue, didn't want to preach about it, didn't want to make it a thing that their faith took on, didn't want to condemn it from the pulpit because they didn't want to upset the balance. William Ellery Channing was one of the great Unitarian ministers of the 1800s, and he resisted speaking about slavery from the pulpit for a long time because he feared it might alienate some of the wealthier members of his congregation who didn't own slaves themselves, but who owned mills that made clothing that was made with cotton that came from the fields plowed by those slaves, tended by those slaves. And he was right, because years later, when he was finally pulled to speak out, many of his members left. Now, Unitarians in Channing's day were firm believers in individuality, independence, not merely for this life, but for their eternal souls. Salvation by character, they called it. Humans could bring themselves closer to the image of God by contemplation and study of religion and ethics, those great ideas and teachers. Little thought was given to all the work other people had to do to give those Unitarians, most of whom looked like me, the time and the space for all that contemplation and study. You know, we can trace our contemporary emphasis on the idea of the individual right of conscience to those days. Then, as now, that individual right of conscience is a valuable idea that, if carried too far, shields us from recognizing or taking responsibility for all of the ways that we are unavoidably interconnected. But here is the gift of that interconnection. We can, if we are willing to hear them, depend on other people to let us know when we might have gone too far, when we might be getting things wrong. I mean, Channing, yeah, he resisted speaking about slavery, but he was brought along by people who told him it was his job as a leader of this faith to speak out. Unitarian churches eventually heard voices from within and without, especially, it turns out, voices from women here in the Midwest, mostly in Iowa, in the late 1800s, who pointed out that, hey, this church thing doesn't happen just because one guy stands in a pulpit. It takes all of us. And so the churches, maybe grudgingly and slowly, sometimes kicking and screaming, widened their vision so that church was not merely about individual character, but to recognize that it depends and serves a wider community. Now, those lessons have never been learned in full. They probably can't ever be learned in full. It was the proposed revision to our Article 2, the portion of our bylaws that is kind of our statement of faith. One of the revisions there tells us that we should always be learning and transforming, that we are never finished, never perfect. So 6 years or so ago, the non-white staff at the UUA had to remind this faith, us good liberals, that our church was still relies, on patterns and institutions and structures rooted in white supremacy, white privilege, because we are in this culture. So of course we did. And that's something we can't change without listening. Listening to people who had enough faith in us to speak out and think we would do something about it. To challenge us to be better, to live up to those values that we claim in the 7 Principles and in the revised Article 2. And another example, about a decade ago, the UUA decided that it would shift its investments away from particularly fossil fuels, given the climate crisis. I was at GA a week ago, General Assembly, where we as a faith gather once a year to do our business. And at this General Assembly, a coalition of young people from our faith put forth a business resolution that would have forced us to move that divestment basically immediately. They told us, we don't think you're living up to your faith. We're not putting our money where we say our values are. They argued passionately. And their resolution was voted down. Probably wisely. I voted against it. But I also took time, when I ran into one of the young women who argued in favor of it, to thank her for making us think, for making me uncomfortable. We need to be able to depend on each other, to call each other in when there is a need, to be the people we want to be, who we say we are, to live this faith. And sometimes, often, when we're doing it right, that is uncomfortable. As Reverend Crow points out in the reading this morning, accepting the ways that we depend on other people, that is spiritual discipline. For her, in that moment, it was accepting personal help in a moment of crisis. Her house had just burned down. But I think the same idea applies to bigger questions, too. To realize we depend on each other to learn, to figure out what our values are and how to put them into practice, to recognize our own mistakes and our successes, to see the harm we do as well as the way we make things better. That, I think, is the way to the salvation that matters in this life. It's not about individual character. It's about who we are together. In the words of the late Paul Wellstone, we all do better when we all do better. So we could say that for our independent faith to work, we need to depend on each other to question and challenge the ways we express and use that independence. We could say that, but we shouldn't. Instead, we should just dump this silly story of independence altogether. Independence always depends on something else. So independence does not exist. We convince ourselves that it does, maybe because we don't want to admit the inequities we depend on to spin the yarn of independence. The way we are interdependent isn't equitable. It isn't fair. Admitting our interdependence makes us face the ways we've abused the people and the planet that we have been depending upon. That takes spiritual discipline. And I just don't think we can do it alone. So, let us embrace, let us celebrate our interdependence. In a world that is sometimes foreboding, sometimes joyous, usually a little of both, and always uncertain, we can look to the interconnected divinity from Nancy Schaefer's poem this morning. This may be adequate for the night. This holding, something that steadfastly breathes us, which we are also learning to breathe. Interdependence it's the very air we breathe. That's why we don't notice until that air is clogged with smoke. It is inescapably the nature of being to be interdependent, as Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh illustrates with the example of a simple table. For a table to exist, he wrote, we need wood, a carpenter, time, skillfulness, and many other causes. And each of these causes needs other causes to be. The wood needs the forest, the sunshine, the rain, and so on. The carpenter needs his parents, breakfast, fresh air, and so on. And each of those things in turn has to be brought about by other conditions. If we continue to look in this way, we'll see that nothing has been left out. Everything in the cosmos has come together to bring us this table. Looking deeply at the sunshine, the leaves of the trees, the clouds, we can see the table. The one can be seen in the all, and the all can be seen in the one. I'm not as optimistic as Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm not convinced that any of us individually is ever able to see the all in the one, or to see the all at all. It's too much for any one of us. I've always liked Reverend Forrest Church's metaphor of the cathedral of the world, where everybody stands and is looking out a window at just a slice of reality, of truth. But only their own slice. To get more of the picture, we need each other. This week I came across a poem by Reverend Victoria Safford that I think captures that in a way that I like even more. In this closing lines to this poem, The Gates of Hope, she describes the gates from the title as the place from which you glimpse not only the struggle, but the joy of the struggle. And as we stand there, beckoning and calling, telling people what we are seeing, asking people what they see. That's the part that's left out of Forest Church's Cathedral of the World. Telling people what we see, asking what they see. There is more truth, more understanding, more everything than any one of us can ever see alone. Even together, we're never going to get it all. That's why we have to keep transforming. We have to remember that we are never finished and never perfect, because we can never get it all. But together, we can at least get a little more, and then a little more. When other people ask us what we see, we have to think about it, reflect and reconsider before we can describe it. When they tell us what they see, some of our own blank spots begin to fill in. Or maybe we'll figure out that if we turn our head just right, the thing we're looking at that didn't make any sense at all suddenly makes sense. Or maybe we'll decide some of them are full of crap. We're all still human. We'll still get things wrong. But we can learn together. Consider, for example, the second banana. so caught up in her own misery, her own narrow vision of what mattered, that she didn't get enough stage time, that she only got half a line, that she couldn't see how First Banana was looking at the whole thing in a different way, in abject terror. Second Banana saw that stage as a place to be adored. First Banana as a place to be avoided. Only by depending on each other, sharing a little of what they both saw, did they see a place to share a banana split. I mean, as ways to approach this life we're all in together, that's pretty appealing. Amen. And so may it be.